Growth that works for everyone. Well, that's the one of the key themes that the G7 leaders will be spending their time discussing, ways to build economic growth that works for everyone. But hanging over the discussions, of course, will be the U.S. president's decision to slap steel and aluminum tariffs on his allies and his efforts to rewrite the rules on trade deals. All in all, it sets up a challenge for Canada at the summit and could crowd out the wider discussions on economic transformation. Let's bring in three guests to discuss the growth agenda and what to watch for at the summit. From Toronto today, we're joined by Dion Polar, Assistant Professor at the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. She's a specialist in gender and the economy. And here in Ottawa, I'm joined by Scotty Greenwood, an expert in Canada-U.S. relations. She's the CEO of the Canadian-American Business Council and a former U.S. diplomat here in Ottawa. She usually joins us from Washington, but we have her in the city of Ottawa today, so great to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks.
And Angela McEwen is the Senior Economist at the Canadian Labour Congress. Good to see you as well. Thank you all for joining me to have this discussion. So we'll get in a moment to the conversation about the economic agenda and creating growth that works for everyone. But Scotty, let me start with you. How does this cloud of trade wars and Donald Trump, the disruptor, hang over not just this conversation at the summit, but all of them?
Well, it really is disruptive, Peter. It's unfortunate. The president and the administration have chosen to use old statutes related to national security to try to get a trade advantage, which is not only inappropriate, it doesn't make sense, but it also runs the risk of harming the U.S. economy. I think for the G7, it's no longer going to be the G7. I think it's going to be the G6+1, because I don't think there will be a consensus. Remember, it used to be the G8, and we know what happened to the eighth partner. So I think it's a real challenge here, and the president likes to do things differently, but unfortunately he's doing things differently, we fear, in a way that's counterproductive, not just for our trading partners around the world, but for the United States itself and for our own self-interest, and that is really unfortunate.
And Angela, what do you think this means for the summit? I think a lot of people looked at the agenda and said, okay, they're getting to some real stuff here if they can find consensus on making some changes. Maybe you don't agree with all of that, but what does this change?
Well, I don't think it changes that much, because I think we've known who Trump was since he's been elected, and we've known that there would be difficult conversations at the summit. We've tried to talk to him about gender equality, and he's willing to talk maybe about women in business, but only very, very narrowly, right? And he wants to talk about progressive trade, but he's not really wanting to talk about how to actually make it work for workers, right? He doesn't talk about changes that benefit the broad majority. He kind of just wants to smash everything and use that as a way to get his own way and further his own personal interests, which is actually, I agree, contrary to American interests. So I think this brings that original conflict into sharper focus, but it was always going to be the G6+1. And I think it just makes the need for these conversations more intense.
Dion, let me get your thoughts on this. Does it turn the agenda upside down now?
Well, I mean, I'm of the opinion that we should just ignore everything he's doing altogether, because I think that it really undermines what should be the primary focus of the summit, which is on the deep structural problems around increasing inequality, the changing nature of work, and persistent poverty around the world.
Okay, let's go there. I mean, Scotty, you're for a long time, you're plugged into the diplomatic side, you're plugged into the business side. You look at these agenda items, and this is Canada's agenda. Canada wants to talk to the rest of the G7 leaders and come out with a plan that talks about, yeah, how to make trade fairer for everyone, how to raise up women in economies around the world. How much progress do you think they can make on that?
Well, having the conversation is certainly important, and Canada's leadership in defining the agenda is meaningful. So I don't think we should discount that just because you've got this recalcitrant disruptor from south of the border. I think the conversation's meaningful, but I think we're going to have kind of a new vocabulary at the G7, actually, or at least it's new to me, maybe not to colleagues on the panel. But when you talk about gender, I think we're going to learn what intersectionality means, which is a concept about discrimination is not just about gender. Often it comes from lots of different places: class, place in society, and these are very important conversations to have. And Canada is showing a leadership role in at least convening the discussion.
All right, Dion, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, in terms of the agenda, do you like what you see in terms of what Canada was hoping to do at the summit? Not sure how much success it'll have at getting some kind of consensus, but do you like what you see in terms of the direction?
I do. The only thing I would want to highlight is that I think they're touching on all of the right issues, But I think it's important that they start to think about how these, and maybe it's related to intersectionality, but it goes much beyond all of the different kinds of groups like class and gender and race and all of these things, to actually think about how the different problems are interconnected. So for instance, we can't talk about inclusive growth for all or the changing nature of work and focus on the labor market without understanding that by focusing on traditional forms of business and innovation and the traditional labor market in these ways, that we're really ignoring that a lot of people are actually excluded from the traditional labor market, and that's where a lot of inequality comes from. And so I think it's important that in this conversation that the leaders really think about how all of these different problems are interlinked, especially with the focus now on thinking these things through from different angles.
Angela, what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, they did make an effort to mainstream gender equality in the other 4 topic areas.
It's the overarching.
Yeah. Exactly. So they are starting to think about, if we're building a future economy, what's that going to look like? But I haven't seen the actions that are going to come out of that, right? How are you going to do that? They're starting to have the conversation, which I think is really important. And maybe that's the thing that comes out of this, is to have that new vocabulary to set the tone for future conversation.
Go ahead, Scott.
Well, and it's also about what are the resources that the governments are prepared to bring about. Often when you get world leaders together at something like a G7, there is a commitment that comes out of it of new resources to tackle big global problems, because after all, it is the leadership of these countries that's needed to put real money and real effort. It's not just the job of civil society, it's also the job of modern economies.
And it brings us back again to the Trump conversation. I mean, if they talk about that around the table, is he the guy putting the damper on that, saying, you know, I'm more interested in dealing with what I have at home than I am on trying to, because this conversation at the summit is supposed to also be about how to raise up developing countries and so on with new economic, any deals we talk about, any progress we talk about has to include them as well. And is Donald Trump going to be standing there saying, all fine and good, you guys worry about that, I'm over here trying to do what's right for the American worker?
I mean, I think Trump's a giant warning sign for the other leaders of what could happen if they don't take concrete action, right? We've seen him actually identify a real problem that the economic policies we've had over the past 30 or 40 years of just signing free trade agreements and not making sure that the benefits are shared, of just lowering taxes and not making sure that we, you know, have social programs that lower those barriers for other groups of people, how they're affected differently, this intersectionality. So women need childcare in order to go into the labor force. People with disabilities need accommodation, and employers need to know what that means and how to do that, right? Yeah. So we need these concrete things so that we don't all go down the Trump road.
Dion, let me hear you on that.
Well, I think one of the things, definitely inequality across countries is much larger than we would see within developed countries like Canada and the United States. But I think that we can take some lessons from things that we've learned about inequality in Canada through some of the research that's been done, for instance, out in Western Canada, around thinking through different ways and different models, rather than always going back to sort of the idea that government can solve all the problems with top-down programs. Because I think that in many cases, as we've seen even in our own countries, like in Canada out west, that some of those programs and policies have not actually benefited many people. And so I think we can take some of the lessons that we've learned in our own countries and maybe try and think about trying to address going to those communities and in other countries as well to figure out what their needs are, what kinds of things they would like to see. I think the conversation at the policy level and with you know, politicians around the world is important, but ultimately it doesn't always translate into the kinds of problem solving and kinds of things we need to see on the ground. Let's
finish on this if I can. One of the things that Canada is going to be pushing at this summit is this notion of leveraging private investment in developing countries. That, you know, a lot of aid comes from governments around the world and so on, and some of this has been tried in the U.S. and in Britain. And I guess for a lot of people the question is, okay, how could they make that work? And Scotty, let me start with you, because private companies go where there's profit to be made. And how do you convince them that it's a good idea to invest in developing countries in some of these signature programs? Specifically, Canada wants to raise up women and girls. Where's the money in that for them?
Well, investing in women and girls is a terrific idea, and the private sector understands that from many areas. But a perfect example to your question, Peter, is when you look at sustainability, which is another one of the areas. And where does the money come from? Well, one of the things we'll see at the G7, I think, is an Oceans Plastics Pact. Right. And if you look at the Coca-Cola Company, to take one private sector example, they have a pledge to be packaging neutral by, I think, 2025 or something, and they don't have enough, there's not enough plastic, that infrastructure collecting the plastic, the pollution, to allow them to get to that goal. So they're creating a market just by that one company, that one pledge, to help get to that goal. So it's going to take investment and infrastructure on the sustainability side, and it's going to take a recognition on the women and girls empowerment that you can't leave behind, as Hillary Clinton said, 51% of the population, and hope to do well. Business understands that and is absolutely at the table for these conversations.
Right. John, let me come to you, and then Angela on that. Private companies investing in women and girls in developing countries, how do you make it happen?
Well, I think we need private companies to be involved in all of the solutions that we might want to try and implement. But I actually think we want to think more deeply about alternative models to economic development, alternative business models, models that haven't been getting as much attention or as much support from government, and even at many levels of government have been facing barriers to the development of organizations that actually might be more useful to empowering women and girls and just everybody who's in local contexts in their local communities. Models that actually are more able to solve some of the local challenges that people are facing. And I think thinking more broadly about different kinds of models is an important first step.
Yeah.
Well, one quick example would be if you look at what MasterCard is doing in Africa, for example. In order to get aid and in order to do many of the things we do in modern society, you need identity. You need proof of who you are, and people don't carry those papers around. So MasterCard has had a very innovative program where they have given people the means of electronic identity validation, so that it's kind of like they skipped over landline phones in Africa years ago and went straight from nothing to cell phones. That's what's happening through the leadership of companies like MasterCard, who are saying, okay, we're going to help you with your electronic identity. We're going to deliver aid directly to you. It cuts out a lot of the opportunity for graft and corruption, and it gives people a source of identity. So there are really innovative solutions. I could go on and on. Johnson & Johnson's doing mental health. Yeah. So
I think local ownership is really important as well.
That's
so
true.
Things like cooperatives, or in India, there's a Self-Employed Women's Association where they've banded together and they have their own bank, and they loan each other money and support each other in creating their own partnerships. But I think one thing we really need to commit to here is corporate accountability, especially in supply chains, because I don't think the answer is going to be from MasterCard's solutions. I think we have to make sure that you can compete on a level playing field by paying your workers fairly in the third world. If you can't, if there's always going to be another corporation that will come in and underbid you, this race to the bottom, then that creates a situation that's very difficult to have development in. What we need is a race to the top. We need a virtuous circle.
Thank you. Quickly, John, to you.
Well, and that's one reason I would push and return to the co-op model as one option, where the owners are of the organization or the business are also the users of the primary users of the services, and that causes some scalability challenges that maybe private businesses could work in partnership with some of these organizations. But I really think we have to think about different kinds of ownership and governance structures altogether.
All right, thank you all. Lots to consider in our conversation today. Good to have you all here, and we'll see what happens at the summit. Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.